Hello everyone, welcome to this WFA webinar. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We're looking forward to an hour of talking about music rights management. It's a pleasure to have everybody here. We've got a really good number of people on this call. I think we should be in total around about 30 or so, primarily from Europe and the Americas and North America as well. So we're looking forward to a good set of discussions. We should aim to finish this, I think, before the top of the hour. So for those of you with calls in about an hour or so, we'll get through all of this before then. Just to hopefully preempt questions that we normally get, our slides will be shared following this webinar, so you'll receive an email either from myself or from Natalia with an attachment with the slides and the content from today's session. So we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible within the sort of the confines of this particular format. So before the end of the hour, we'll try and find a moment to get through your questions for us and for Richard, who's going to be sharing some content later. So on your screens, you should see a Q&A box. In that Q&A box, you can type your questions, and they'll be shared with the whole group, and we'll hopefully get around to answering those. If we don't get around to answering all the questions, then we'll aim to send those to Richard, and then Richard can have a chance to engage with those, and we can potentially share some content afterwards. All right, so then let's get started. So just by way of introductions, I'm Steve. I work at WFA. I'm there on the left. I'm also joined on this by Natalia, who's helping us with the logistics of today's session. And then also there is Richard Kirstein. He's a founding partner of Resilient Music. Rich is joining us, and he's going to be sharing some thoughts on the way that music is being managed. But before we get started on that, I'll just give a quick introduction to WFA. For those of you who don't know who we are, I think you probably all do by now, but just in case you don't, WFA is the global trade association that represents clients, and we have a couple of different types of members. We have national advertiser associations in over 50 countries, and you'll see some of those countries there on this slide, which brings together major markets worldwide. Those associations are in China, in Canada, in Chile, and all over the world. And in addition to that, we also obviously have over 70 global corporates in membership. And some of those companies you'll see listed on those charts just there. So we're very fortunate to have a very broad diaspora of corporate members, and also a broad network of national associations who are making up the participants on today's call. So with that, we should turn to the topic in hand today. So music is obviously one of those subjects which has come up a lot recently in a lot of different discussions. We first heard from Richard and Resilient, I think a couple of years ago, in fact, and he gave us an update on the state of play with regards to managing synchronization, managing licensing, managing the costs associated with music. And he's here today to give us an update on where the industry currently stands. So with that in mind, Richard, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll throw it over to you.
Steve, thank you very much indeed, and good morning or good afternoon to you all, wherever you are, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. So this is a music rights update, helping brands keep up to speed with the music rights landscape, which is always changing. So what are we going to look at today? I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Resilient. We're then going to look at why is there no standard music rate card, and this is a question I'm asked a lot, particularly by procurement people. We're then going to drill down into the complexity of music rights. Why is it so complex? Why is it such a difficult area? And then within that, we're going to look at who are the parties that you need to pay if you're licensing a particular track for a commercial or a piece of video content. And then within that, we're going to look at the various cost drivers. What are the factors that impact on pricing, and how can you try to control those? So we're going to look at some price management strategies. We also need to consider that if we are licensing third-party controlled music, we're dealing with other people's copyrights, other people's intellectual property. And with that comes an element of risk, particularly if it's mismanaged. So I'll give you some tips on how to manage that properly. And then finally, we'll pick out some takeaways and look at a couple of case studies as well, which might help you to understand some of the points we're going to discuss today. So, quick intro to Resilient. We are a consultancy that helps brands and agencies navigate the uncertain world of music rights. We are based in the UK and the US. We work with a variety of different clients, mostly in the alcoholic beverage, automotive and fashion areas. These are some of the clients you can see there. So we're going to start with music buying. Why isn't there a standard rate card? So this is a question essentially around the idea of commodity. Is music commoditized or not? Well, the answer to that is sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And then we need to really answer that question, think about the different types of music as broken down by, I suppose, copyright category. So the first category we are going to look at is called production library music, and this is truly commoditized. Now you'll see those red arrow links on the page. When you get your decks, you can click on those and listen through to a number of some examples that I've given you. But for the purpose of today, we won't do any listening. So this first category, production library music, is the musical equivalent really of a stock footage library. So if you think of, say, a library like Getty Images, for example, a production music library is the audio equivalent of that. So the complexity is low, it's license based, and there is a single rights owner. And this is interesting because it means you can license all the rights from one party. The music is pre-cleared, which means that there's no approval process involved. It's a predictable cost, and that cost is typically low. In some markets, so for example the UK, there is a fixed rate card. In the UK it's controlled by PRS for Music, which is a collection society or performing rights organisation, it's sometimes known as. In other markets the prices are determined by individual libraries, but they tend to work off their own rate cards, so it's highly commoditized. The second category we will look at, I've called the hired gun. This is the idea of hiring a composer to compose a bespoke score specific to your requirements for your particular project. The complexity is a little higher, but generally you're dealing with a single rights owner with the composer, or sometimes their publisher if they have one. The cost is reasonably predictable in that there'll be a fee for the composer and then a fee for the production element, the studio and the musicians that may be involved. And there's a low to medium risk. The third category, and this is the complex one, this is most of what we'll focus on today, is the commercial catalogue, which is very much a free market. You'll see that as I go through this deck, I'm using the track Shake It Off by Taylor Swift as an example, simply to illustrate the way rights are broken down. Now this is a highly complex area. It's always license-based in that you are licensing rights from a third party. There are typically multiple rights owners, and almost always there is prior consent required from the rights owners, who in turn seek consent from their talent, who are their songwriters and their artists. The cost is highly variable, and this is the thing that's often quite difficult for brands to understand, that it can seem highly irrational and almost a sense of rights owners just pick a figure out of the air, which sometimes they do, and the risk can be very high if you get it wrong. So moving on, we're just going to touch on some market variations in relation to bespoke score, and for those of you that do commission original music, it's worth being aware of this. So in America, there is a long-standing tradition of assignment-based business models for bespoke music. Now, what does that mean? That means if you hire a composer, the usual model is that the composer assigns all rights, so an assignment of copyright in the composition and the recording, to the commissioning body, which is typically the brand or their agency, and that means there is subsequently no limitation on usage and no relicensing fees, because the commissioning body owns that work outright. And in the States, that's typically called work for hire, and it's a very advantageous business model for the commissioning body, the brand or the agency. However, in Europe, the usual business model is license-based. Now that means typically the supplier or the composer or a music production company retains all the rights in the composition and the recording and grants a limited license by term, territory and media to their client, which will be a brand or an ad agency. And that means that when the client needs to extend the license, they might need an additional year, or they might need to extend it to further markets, they need to pay additional fees. So there's a key difference between those two markets there, between the US and Europe. So, moving on, let's now dig into the complexity of the third category, which, if you remember, is the commercial catalogue, or what I call the free market. And we're going to use Taylor Swift, Shake It Off, as an example. Now, for those of you who kept up to speed with the Grammys, you may have come across his character Max Martin, who is one of 3 songwriters of this song. Now, Max Martin won a Grammy last night, I think, in recognition of some of the very famous songs he's written, which go all the way back to hits that he wrote in the 90s for Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys, amongst others. But he's still writing hit records, one of them being Shake It Off. Now, you can see on the left, we are dealing with the songwriters who have written this song, and they each have separate publishing deals. Now, it so happens that 2 of the songwriters, the 2 Swedish guys, Max Martin and Shellback, are both published by an independent publisher called Cobalt, and between them they have 2/3 of the song. Taylor Swift, however, is published by Sony ATV, which is one of the 3 major publishers. The important thing to note is that in licensing this song, you have to have all 3 shares fully approved and licensed before you can use the song. You can't go ahead with just some of the pieces, you have to have all of them. Now, on the other side of the page, on the right hand side, we're looking at the sound recording. And Taylor Swift is the featured artist, so already we can see she's wearing 2 hats. She is both a songwriter and a recording artist. Now, in America, Taylor Swift is signed as a recording artist to Big Machine Records, but they have a deal with Universal Music for the world excluding the USA. So if in a market within Europe you were licensing this recording, you would have to approach the local office of Universal to do so. So already we can see there are a number of parties if you wanted to license this track. So you'd have to get the publishing rights from Cobalt for 2 different writers, from Sony ATV for Taylor Swift, and the master rights, which is for the recording, from Universal for Taylor Swift. So there are a number of different parties here. So we then need to think about, who do we pay if we're brokering a deal with these parties? Well, if you are a brand or an agency taking this track and putting it against a piece of film, that invokes what's called the synchronization right, which is a right protected in law, which is the right to synchronize a piece of copyright music or a recording of that music against a piece of moving image. And typically the music publishers and the record label grant those licenses directly to the brand or the agency and expect to be paid directly. Now, you can see in the bottom right hand corner, I've also called out the non-featured artists. Now, it may be on this particular recording that there are session musicians. If you listen to this track, you'll hear there is a baritone sax, which might be a sample, but it could also be a real baritone saxophone player. Now, where those musicians are members of a performers union, the right to use that recorded performance is not granted by the record label of the featured artist. Instead, it's granted by the performers union. In the UK, that union is called the MU, or the Musicians Union. In America, it's the American Federation of Musicians. And when you are dealing with a sound recording that has session musicians on it, which might be anything from 1 sax player to a 100-piece orchestra, it's always worth checking with the union for the market in which that track was originally recorded. Do they own rights in it? And if so, for how many players? It's something worth checking every time. So what are the cost drivers? How does that work? What are the factors that impact on the fees? And how is that landscape changing? So one of the key factors when you're brokering a deal, not only for music but also talent as well, is of course usage. And usage essentially falls into 3 different categories: term, territory, and media. Now, one of the interesting things that's happening in media is the manner in which music rights owners are valuing online. So going back quite a few years, when a brand or an agency was approaching a rights owner about a commercial, internet usage was considered sort of a minor add-on, and the rights owners were very much focused on what was the above-the-line usage, and sometimes global online use would be sort of thrown in for little or no fee. That has completely changed over the last 5 years, and particularly within the last year. And we are now seeing certainly the major music publishers pricing any global YouTube usage almost as high as broadcast above the line usage. And this has surprised quite a number of brands who haven't really devoted the necessary budget to accommodate that. It's a trend I see continuing. I think the independents will start to adopt that as well, as will all the record labels. And we will eventually see particularly a global online use, especially on YouTube, being as if not more expensive than broadcast, which a few years ago would have been unthinkable. Now we will go on to see ways in which you can mitigate that through geo-locking. Looking at territory, as you would expect, the more markets that you use, the more you will pay. Looking at term, the unusual shape for the line there is that if, for example, you are buying a year's license or bursts up to a year, where you build in options to extend that term beyond the first year, typically you can limit that to a 10% uplift. Sadly, you'll never keep the fee the same or even get a discount, but usually you can limit it to a 10% uplift if and only if you build those options into the deal. If you don't build the options into the deal, you can expect to be penalized, as we will go on to see. So we talked before about geo-locking, and this is a big change in the way that music rights owners are working. So something I would recommend you to consider where you are working on a campaign where the offline elements are not global. So for example, it might be a campaign limited to the UK or certain markets within Europe or even just the US. It's worth considering if you can geo-lock your online content to match that market. Now the way you can do that is by approaching YouTube for either the brand or their agency to be set up as a YouTube partner. And I believe that when that is done, it's possible to geo-lock a particular YouTube piece of content to an individual market. And that means that you can help to control cost. It's definitely something I would recommend. So, cost management, preventative measures. What can you do to help control cost? How can you try and keep a lid on it? So, a number of things to consider here. The cost of music, to some extent, is driven by fame. But fame of a song and fame of a recording artist are different things. Music publishers tend to consider their famous songs as evergreen copyrights. And once a song has been famous for some time, to a publisher it kind of is irrelevant how long it's been famous for, or even who originally made it famous. You'll see one of the case studies later on. We look at a song called Always Something There to Remind Me. That's a very famous song, it's been covered by many people, and it has a very high value, which tends to be consistent. In comparison, the fame of artists can fluctuate, and that can quite often be directly affected by their reputation in the market. So, for example, something may happen in an artist's career. You know, artists sometimes get in trouble with the law. They get arrested for doing less than salubrious things, and that means that they are therefore less desirable, and people no longer want to license their recordings. So the value of those recordings can drop. You will also find that over the arc of an artist's career, their celebrity star, if you like, may rise and fall, and as a result, the value of their recordings may go up and down. To think of one recent example, for those of you who are familiar with Nile Rodgers, who has had amazing success over the last few years, particularly with Daft Punk having been involved with Get Lucky. He quite openly talks about a fallow point in his career after the huge success he had with Chic in the 70s, and yet he's come back. He has a fantastic new lease of life. But had you tried to license one of his recordings maybe 10 years ago, it would have been a different story, and the value might not have been there. So another area to think about is exclusivity. Now, quite often, I've been in situations where brands have mistakenly assumed that just because they buy a license for a particular track, that prevents direct competitors using that track at the same time. Now, that is not true unless you build some exclusivity into your deal. Now, it's quite possible to build in exclusivity to cover direct competitors within a single category. So let's assume you're a brand of whiskey. So let's assume you're Johnny Walker, for example, and you license a track and you want to prevent other whiskey brands using that track in the markets that your campaign is running during the life of that campaign. So it's distinct to the media and the markets that you've licensed. Now, you might typically pay somewhere between an additional 30 to 70 or 80% on top of the fee that you've negotiated. Now, if you wanted that exclusivity to be broader, you might say, well, actually, we want to prevent any alcoholic drink using this track during the life of our campaign. Now, the rights owners of a track may agree, and if they did, you could expect to pay perhaps an extra 80 to 130, 140% if they were willing to agree. Now, going beyond that, I've yet to see a campaign where, for a reasonably well-known recording or song, a rights owner has given a fully all-brand exclusive license. I'm sure they are done, but typically they would be done at a very high premium. And it is not something that I would suggest you could expect very often. So moving on, a couple of other key issues that have a huge effect on pricing, and sadly these are the issues that I see many brands and agencies getting wrong and paying the consequences. So urgency. I cannot stress enough the importance of dealing with music early, as we will see later on, and therefore avoiding panic, avoiding a situation where you're dealing with music at the 11th hour, because rights owners will very openly penalise you for that, because they can. Secondly, the competitive landscape. I see many examples of agencies making one music track recommendation excuse me, to their client without any backups on the table. Now, this gives enormous leverage to the rights owners of that particular track, and again is not a recommended strategy from my point of view. It's always good to have choice in order that you have a walk-away position. So we're going to come to our first poll. So it's time to do some voting, and the question is, what's the comparison in fees for extending a license term with versus without an option? So let's vote.
Thanks, Richard. So I'll just talk you through this one, guys. So this requires a bit of input from you. So let's just go through that question again. So what's the comparison in fees for extending a license term with versus without an option? Let's see who's been paying attention over the course of this webinar. I think I know the answer, Richard, but I actually wouldn't put too much money on me getting the right option here. But it looks like we're getting loads of responses through. So there were a few different options Richard selected there. So with an option 10% uplift, without an option 25%, and it goes all the way down to with an option with a 10% uplift versus over 100% uplift. Let's see exactly what people are thinking. So we're going to see those results now, and we'll see quite a mixed picture actually. Let's see how Richard responds to this. But majority of people are kind of selecting the first option. So they're thinking it's with an option it's around a 10% uplift, and then without an option a 25% uplift.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much for that. So my experience of this particular question is sadly music rights owners will seek every opportunity to penalise you if you don't have an option. So it's not uncommon certainly to have a 10% increase if you do include an option. But equally to have a 100% increase or more if you don't include an option. Music rights owners know that if you've already licensed a track for a particular campaign, that track is associated with it, and the brand and their agency are very unlikely to want to run that campaign again with a different track, because clearly the creative content of the campaign has changed, and therefore the rights owners know that the tolerance to pain for a fee increase is fairly high, and therefore they will seek to charge the maximum they feel they can get away with. So therefore the lesson from this is always build options into your deal. So this is what we're going to look at here. I suppose if I'd perhaps drawn those bars a little bit more in proportion, I could have demonstrated that sort of 1 to 10 ratio. But the point being here, it costs you nothing to build options into a deal. So you want to think about not only all the usage rights you need, but all the potential usage rights you might need. So think of it as must-haves and nice-to-haves, and build as many options into your deal as you can to extend the term, the territory, and the media. So moving on, we're going to think here about competitive tendering. So why wouldn't you use competitive tendering? Now, most of you in your companies will use competitive tendering to buy goods and services across a very broad range of product categories. And I suggest that you consider that for music as well. Now, the way we recommend that to clients is to say, think about your creative requirement. What do you want people to feel when they view your commercial and hear the music on it? And as a result, you could create an emotional objective and a music brief. On the commercial side, you should quite easily be able to set out the usage that you require and your maximum available budget, and therefore build a commercial brief, perhaps offering at best half that available budget, maybe even less, as an opening gambit, and setting out the usage that you need. And combining those two parts, you can build a music sourcing tender that you put out to tender to the music rights community. So essentially, music publishers and record labels, and possibly artist managers if you're thinking about unsigned artists. And from that, you can get a variety of track submissions, which you can then listen to and filter and build a shortlist. And out of that shortlist, you might have your hero track and some backups. But the whole point of doing this is that this has come through the filter of a commercial brief. So these tracks have been pitched against a specific usage requirement and a budget, and particularly where the product category is something that might be seen as contentious, such as alcohol. The music rights owners are, you would hope, only going to pitch titles that they know they can clear for that product category. So once you've got your short list of tracks, and here we're using female pop artists to illustrate the idea, I would recommend clients negotiate from a position of strength by approaching all the rights owners for multiple tracks and trying to secure multiple approvals. So in this example, I'm suggesting you might manage to simultaneously clear tracks by Katy Perry, Taylor Swift and Jessie J, where you know that they are clearable and you know how much they cost. And out of that, you can make your final choice. And when you do, you are safe in the knowledge that you've achieved a better value outcome because it's been done so in a competitive environment. And at each stage, you've had a walk away position because you haven't bet everything on one particular track. So from here, we then think about, well, when do we do this? And I would recommend that this process is started as early as possible, ideally in pre-production. Now, what I tend to see is that a lot of people don't do this until post-production, and therefore it's condensed and compressed into a much shorter timescale. But where you do it over a longer timescale, you've got far greater control, and the lack of urgency within your negotiations plays to your advantage. However, at the other end of the scale, if you're in a position of having urgency and almost desperation in clearing something against a tight deadline, the rights owners have all the advantage. So let's now look at why is it advantageous to start early. Now, to do that, you need to understand the long approval chains within the music clearance process. Whilst you might just be approaching a music publisher or record label, there is then a long series of parties that get involved behind the scenes before you get the answer that you want, which would be an approval, or the answer you don't want, which would be a denial. And you have to remember that for all of these songs and recordings, most of the time, the artist and the songwriter have the right of approval, and they can, and quite often do, say no. So, thinking of our example with Taylor Swift and Shake It Off. Let's say you're in the UK and you approach the 3 different UK publishers, or sorry, there were 2, but in respect of 3 songwriters. They then have to approach the local office for those songwriters, and if you remember, 2 were Swedish and 1 was American, the American one being Taylor Swift. The publishers then approach the manager of the songwriter, who then in turn approaches the songwriter. And the songwriter might be in the studio, they might be on tour, they might not deal with these requests every day. So there's going to be a delay to even getting to them. It could be of a few days to a couple of weeks. Now the same process happens with the recording. You approach the record label in your market, who then will in turn approach the record label that actually owns the recording. They will approach the manager of the artist, who then approaches the artist. So thinking of our example of Shake It Off, there's actually 4 lots of lines of approval going on. to the 3 songwriters and the 1 artist. Now, of course, Taylor Swift is both the artist and one of the songwriters, so the 2 sets of requests converge when they get to her, but they arrive via different channels. So then we have to think about, how does the news come back to you? Well, it comes back down the chain in the opposite direction, but in the process there may be some negotiation going on. It may be that you provisionally agree fees with the UK office of a label and publisher, and they approach their original publisher, which could be in Sweden or America in this case, and they say, no, we want more money, or no, we don't want to license that breadth of rights, we want to narrow it. And so there's some sort of horse trading that goes on until the deal is in a place that the local office are willing to put the deal forward to the manager, who in turn has to try and sell it to the songwriter and the artist. And all of this takes time. So the key lesson here is, don't leave it to the last minute, start as early as possible. So, a key question for you to think about here: how do you know if you're paying too much for your music? And this is a question I frequently get asked, and my answer is usually audit your brand and benchmark against others. So what do I mean by audit in this case? Well, typically I would ask a brand to try and secure, usually via its agency, the music licenses for a past project, so that we can review those, compare the publishing and the master recording licenses against each other. Also compare them against the bought media schedule to check that the rights that were licensed matched the rights that were needed. Then we would consider the fees and give a point of view on whether or not we felt those fees were fair. Finally, I would look at to what extent the licenses had options in them to extend term, territory or media. And then we would consider the extent to which those options were exercised because of extensions to the media in the media schedule, or whether any renegotiation had to take place, and if so, at what cost. And then we could compare that cost versus the 10% uplifts that likely would have been paid if the options had been in the deal. So auditing is a good way to understand where you are now, and in order to then set where would you like to be in terms of how your music buying is working. So let's now look at risk. Remember that you're licensing third-party intellectual property, so that comes with a risk if you get it wrong. So how is the landscape changing here? Firstly, we are seeing greater vigilance by the rights owners, both with human and automated search systems, trawling the web looking for film content that has their music in it and trying to identify the usages that are not licensed. This is a really important thing if you're a music publisher or a record label. It's a great way of earning extra money, is finding people who are using your tracks and your songs without licenses and then going after them. So what happens if someone comes after you? Well, it starts typically with a cease and desist letter. Stop doing what you're doing, take down your content, take your campaign off air. You might then typically get a penalty fee on top of whatever fee you would have paid had you licensed that usage up front. And that penalty can typically be 50 to 100%, sometimes considerably more. If you don't comply with that cease and desist, things then get particularly nasty. But certainly you will always pay more if you have to secure a retrospective license than if you've done it up front. Now, this is where things start to get particularly painful for brands and agencies. So you can see down the left side I've listed the more important publishers. So the 3 majors are Universal, Sony ATV and Warner Chappell, and the 3 largest independents are BMG, Cobalt and Imagine. On the right hand side I've listed the record labels, the 3 majors, Universal, Sony and Warner, and 3 of the largest independents, Beggars, Pias and Domino. Now all these companies and many more have the right to take content down from YouTube that contains unlicensed material that they own. They don't even need to ask Google to do it for them. They can take it directly down. And I've been in situations with clients who have posted things online that they shouldn't have done, where the rights owners had spotted it very quickly and threatened to take content down, which they are able to do. And where that happens, you see this notice. This video is no longer available due to a copyright claim. And if you're a brand and you've posted a piece of content, you do not want your users to see that. Now, where it gets even worse is that YouTube have this 3 strikes rule, which means that if you post content with unlicensed material or unlicensed music 3 times, your entire YouTube channel will be taken down. And users will see this message: this video is no longer available because the YouTube account associated with this video has been terminated due to multiple third-party notifications of copyright infringement. Now that's bad not only because all your content that you want consumers to see becomes invisible, but there's also a reputational damage. You know, your company is then seen by the public as someone who is guilty of copyright infringement, and that's clearly not something that you want to happen. So I would urge you to be extremely careful about what you post on your YouTube channels and what your agency does so on your behalf, in order that you don't fall foul of this particular problem. So risk management, preventative measures. What can we do to try and mitigate risk? So essentially, the problems around risk are twofold. Where you have no license, so you knowingly post something without having a license in place, that's outright copyright infringement, and there is no excuse for that. Where you will have a license, but you do have some usage that falls outside of the license, that's breach of license. It's not quite as bad, but it's still frowned upon very heavily by music rights owners. So the solution is, of course, you want your licenses to be fully aligned with your media schedule. And this applies not only to music, but also to talent. Now this means that you need to try and finalize your media schedule as early as you can and stick to it and not change it. And that's a real challenge for brands, because media agencies will quite frequently find interesting media opportunities for their clients, perhaps at a particular bargain price, for the client to then take advantage of at short notice. Now for media buying that makes sense. For rights buying it's highly problematic, because it then means you're in a position of non-alignment, and non-alignment is what leads to a lot of the problems we've talked about just before. So now we have a second poll. To what extent can you check if your creative agency is buying third-party IP rights in alignment with your media agency's plan? So let's vote.
Great stuff, thank you, Richard. So we'll get some votes in from people now. So let's just have a look at that question again. So to what extent can you check if your creative agency is buying third-party IP rights in alignment with your media agency's plan? So it's basically a question around visibility, and so right at the top you've got no visibility on this, and then it goes down to some good, and then for some clients, for some marketers, great visibility and compliance, total alignment of IP rights buying with our media plan. So we're just going to get a couple more votes in, and then we're going to share those results with you now. So this is probably, as you might expect to see, quite a mixed bag. I think it very much reflects the extent to which some agencies are on top of this and some aren't. Visibility is always a tricky one. I suppose it depends on the type of platforms you're using as well, Richard, right? I guess it depends on the type of relationship you probably have with your agency as well.
It does. The interesting thing here is that the majority say they have some visibility, I find out sometimes, but have little influence to alter behaviours. So I would say, therefore, that the majority of you are at risk, because if you find out after the event, particularly that the media that's been bought doesn't match the rights that have been bought, you're exposed, and you could find that some of these problems around content being taken down could happen to you, which is not a place to be. So I would urge you to try and get greater visibility of your media plan earlier on, and encourage everybody to understand the importance of finalising it and sticking to it, in order that rights that are bought for that piece of content can be done so properly and minimise risk. So what are the issues here to think about? Well, we quite often see situations of brands and agencies knowingly trying to copy a particular piece of music, and this often happens where they try and license a particular track. The usage is denied or it's too expensive, so they commission a composer to write something in the vein of or similar to a particular song. There is often an urban myth about, well, if I change enough notes, it's okay and we'll get away with it. Well, the reality is you probably won't, and music publishers are extremely vigilant about this. They get extremely upset where they think that a brand or an agency has knowingly tried to write something or commission a piece of music close to one of their own songs, and they will come down very heavily on that. The way to avoid that is simply to prohibit the intent to infringe, to not knowingly or openly want to copy a song that you can't have, because it will end in tears. The other issue is this issue of passing off. Now, you might license a song properly from the music publisher and then engage a producer or an arranger to create a re-record of it, or it could even be another artist. But when you do that, it's important that you do not brief that person to directly copy an existing artist recording of that song. You want to make sure your new recording is very noticeably different. It might be in a different key, with different instrumentation, and maybe if the original artist is a male singer, with the new recording you do it with a female singer. So to name check a particular client, and just to be clear, this is not a client that I'm involved with, but it's just for an observation. In the UK, John Lewis is a brand that does a lot of re-records, particularly for their Christmas campaigns, and they do it very well. And they tend to create very different sounding cover recordings of well-known songs. So they adhere to this idea of avoiding a risk of passing off. So we're now going to look at a couple of case studies, things that I've worked on, but I can sort of illustrate some of the complexities of music rights and the manner in which it's done. So firstly, we're going to look at a campaign for Peroni. Now, when you get these decks and you click on these arrows, you'll actually get click-throughs to the YouTube films, which I should say are still very much in license, which is why they're on YouTube. But you'll then be able to see the commercials in question and listen to the tracks. Now, this particular campaign, called Story Distille, has two tracks in it. The first of which is a piece of film score composed by an iconic Italian film composer many of you will know, called Ennio Morricone. Now, he scored many films. This particular one is called Once Upon a Time in America, and it's a cue from that film called Poverty. The music publishing rights, so the composition, is controlled by Warner Chappell, and the recording is controlled by an independent record label called Discord. So even though the composer and the artist is the same person, there are two different deals to be done. Now, interestingly here, even though the recording is an orchestral one, the recording was made in Italy, and having checked with the record label and with Ennio Morricone's management, the rights of the session musicians were bought out entirely and were not controlled by a performers union. So there were no additional performers union fees to pay. So that was the first piece of music in the commercial. It was only there for about 14 seconds or so in the 60-second version. The majority of the commercial was made up using a very famous song called Always Something There to Remind Me. Now this was written by two very famous, iconic songwriters who had a very long-standing partnership, Burt Bacharach and Hal David, I should say. Burt Bacharach being the composer, Hal David being the lyricist. Now, Burt Bacharach's publishing interests are controlled by Warner Chappell, and he has 50% of the song. Hal David's interests are controlled by Universal Music Publishing. And it was quite common in these traditional songwriting partnerships of a composer and a lyricist that the song be split down the middle, 50-50. Now, sadly, Hal David passed away fairly soon, or fairly shortly, I should say, before this campaign started. So we were dealing with Universal Music Publishing, who were dealing with his son, who controlled Hal David's estate. And therefore his son was extremely protective of his father's legacy and his father's catalogue of songs, which made the negotiation had to be handled very sensitively. So the song was licensed from these two publishers. The recording was a 1964 recording by the British pop artist Sandy Shaw, and her recording is controlled by an independent record label called Union Square. Now, on that recording from 1964 were 41 session musicians, mostly string players, but because it was recorded in the UK, they were all members of the Musicians' Union. And so an additional fee had to be negotiated with the musicians union, which was quite substantial because there were 41 players. And that meant that for this one particular song, there were fees paid to 2 publishers, 1 record label, and 1 union. And if we go back a slide, if you remember when we were looking at poverty, there were separate fees paid to 1 publisher and 1 record label. So there were 6 deals done for this one commercial. And even though Warner Chappell, the publisher, had an interest in both poverty and always something there to remind me, they're still separate transactions. So it shows you the numbers of parties involved. We'll now look at another one, and again, you can click on these links in the deck that you receive. This was a campaign for Jaguar through their agency Spark 44, in which the British band The Heavy were commissioned to create a new cover version of A Little Less Conversation. Now, those of you who are Elvis fans will know that this was originally made famous by Elvis Presley in the 60s, and it was written by 2 country songwriters called Billy Strange and Scott Davis. Now, their interests are controlled by an independent publisher called Carlin Music, who has a great deal of historical catalogue. So, for example, they have a lot of music by Ray Davies from the Kinks, amongst others. So that's a very big song that was originally made famous by one of the biggest ever recording artists, so clearly that comes with a very high premium. So separately to licensing the song, there were a number of deals that had to be done in order for the recording to come into being. Now, firstly, if you're dealing with an artist that is exclusively signed to a record label, you have to get what's called an artist waiver from their record label for the privilege of putting them in the studio to create a new recording for you. Now, The Heavy are exclusively signed to Ninja Tune, which is an independent British dance label. So an artist waiver had to be negotiated with them in order that we could put The Heavy in the studio. Now, in addition to that artist waiver, we have to recognise that because the band are exclusively signed to Ninja Tune, the record label will own that recording even though the brand, via their agency, has paid for it. So we have to get what's called a master synchronization license to use that recording. And then finally, the band itself has to be engaged to hire their services as performers, as recording artists. And that's done in the form of a re-record engagement agreement. So for this campaign to go ahead, we had 1 license with a publisher, 2 separate agreements with a record label, and a further agreement with the artists themselves. So there were 4 agreements on that deal. So quite complicated. So to sum up, we're going to look at some takeaways and then we have some time for some Q&A. So the first thing to consider, and I cannot stress this enough, is start earlier with music. Do not leave it to the last minute. If your agency claims that nobody can think about music until there is a finished film to see, I would urge you to push back and go, well, surely we can be thinking about music much earlier than that. We should be thinking about it during pre-production. So at least it is a topic being discussed. Secondly, clarify your usage and don't change it. So that means conversations with your media agency to try to clarify the media schedule as much as you can, as early as possible, and then be sure that nobody changes it during the course of the negotiations for the rights that you need, not only for music but also for talent, celebrities, and so on. And because if the media usage does change, it will cause you problems. Thirdly, establish all the rights owners. As we've seen, there can be multiple parties when you're licensing just 1 track. If you miss one of them out and you go ahead and launch your campaign with a piece missing, it will lead to legal claims because you will have infringed the copyright for that particular piece that you've missed. So it's essential that you know where all the pieces lie. There is an urban myth around, oh, well, I tried to find this particular rights owner, I couldn't find them, I have an email chain to prove that I tried to find them. That is not good enough. And even if you've engaged in dialogue with them and they've stalled with their answer, but you think you've got a sort of approval in place, that is not good enough. You need cast iron, black and white, firm approvals from all the rights owners involved before you launch. Otherwise, you are leaving yourself open to legal claims and costs. And finally, ensure that you have backup tracks and license options. So if you remember, if you have multiple backup tracks, you have a walk-away position. You are able to make choices between a variety of tracks that you may have cleared, and by building options into your deal, you avoid the risk of having to relicense the rights that you bought first time round, because you can exercise options with pre-agreed fees and therefore help mitigate risk and control cost. So there we are. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for your time. My details are here. I'll be very happy to answer any questions if you want to follow up with me, but we do have some time now for some Q&A, so I will pass back to Steve.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. That's great. So there are quite a few questions, so hopefully we can just dive straight in and just try and tick off some of these as they've come in. But one that came in, Richard, which I think is a simple question, which is I suspect maybe a tricky one to answer, but I'm going to go for it anyway. It's about basically the future of music and the price of it. So do you think that music is going to become more or less expensive than it is now? So how do you think the pricing of music is going to evolve over time?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I sometimes see it going in both directions, and a lot of it depends on the rights owners. The major rights owners particularly are ramping up fees for online use, and that's a reaction to two things. One, of course, they see brands moving very substantially out of broadcast media into online, so therefore they want to monetize that. And two, of course, they're no longer making as much revenue as they did from the sale of recorded music, and therefore sync license fees are, in their minds, a way to replace that. The independents, and perhaps at the bottom end of the market, the unsigned area, in some ways fees are falling because there is a desperation to get tracks used in collaboration with brands that perhaps 10 years didn't exist to the same extent. So it's not a straightforward answer.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Sort of building on that, how do you think brands can set themselves up to be the best type of client in this space? So how can brands actually get the best music for their ads? What do you think? What do you think a good client in this space looks like?
Again, very, very good question. I would start with starting early, thinking about music almost right from the beginning of a campaign, but also I think being respectful of artists and rights owners. I see a lot of negotiations, particularly between large global brands and major music companies, where both sides are guilty of a sort of, don't you know who we are attitude, which isn't particularly helpful and usually exacerbates the problems during the course of negotiation. So I think it's starting early, being respectful that you're dealing with someone else's IP, understanding that certainly artists, once they get to a certain level, don't necessarily need an involvement with a brand. So quite frequently, I have conversations with clients who insist that we should offer an extremely low fee for a particular famous track, going, oh, it's going to be great promotion for them. And I kind of make the point, well, they don't need it. They're a big global artist. They don't need this campaign in the way that you think they might do. And that's an important point to embrace.
If we can get a bit more technical, we've got a couple of relatively technical questions I think come in, and it's around the kind of accrued yearly costs that you might experience because of licensing in other countries. So, for example, if you had a campaign that was running in 10 countries, but in the first year only 5 countries. It's only aired in 5 countries in the first year. Do you have to build those 5 countries on as an option for the second year? And then, as a sort of a follow-up question, if a piece of music was going to be running in one country in year 1, but actually it didn't run, and it actually ends up running in year 2 instead, do you end up paying escalation costs? Do you have to still pay that first year fee? How's that sort of accounted for? There's probably quite a bit in that, actually.
Yeah, and actually some of those are very pertinent to one of the clients we work with, and all of it comes down to the point we were making earlier on, the alignment of the media plan with license buying. So to the first point, you only run in 5 markets in year 1 and 10 in year 2. Now, usually you can only extend the license into a second year for the markets in which you've used in the first year. So if you didn't know about the extra 5 markets, so markets 6 to 10, until year 2, and you haven't built that into your year 1 deal, you will be negotiating afresh from a very weak position. However, if you've got visibility into the future and you know in advance that there will be 5 extra markets coming on stream into year 2, you can build them in as an extra option to be exercised. Some rights owners might try to avoid agreeing to that up front because, of course, they would rather be in a position where you have to come back to renegotiate. Others may allow you to do it. So that was the first point. The second point about you do a deal to use a track in one market in year 1, but it doesn't run. Once you've exercised the deal, the rights owner doesn't care whether you've used it or not. They won't give you a refund. They won't give you a credit note. They'll just say, well, you bought it. If you didn't use it, that's your problem. If that exercise was licensed for year 1, whether or not it actually ran, but you have an option within the license to exercise it for year 2 at year 1 fee plus 10%, then yes, you can exercise that option. It would simply be a case that your money you'd spent in year 1 was wasted if the campaign didn't actually run.
Great, okay. And then I think we just got time for one final question. And this is, I think, around the complexity of the number of players in the chain, Richard. So just a couple of comments come in about the nature of how many different contracts need to be signed with the amount of different people, and the notion that there's a lot of middlemen that basically stand in the way of you getting the music that you need. I mean, short of, I guess, working with artists who are self-published, who own their own rights, who manage themselves that way, or indeed working with libraries of assets that are pre-cleared. Is there any way of cutting out the middleman in this instance? What happens when you go directly to artists, for example?
It's a good question, and what happens is the record labels and the music publishers get extremely upset and penalise you on fees. It's a question I get asked very frequently. The thing to understand is, if you are dealing with a songwriter who has assigned their songs to a publisher, is the songwriter no longer owns those songs, the publisher does. And even though the songwriter might have the right of approval, they're not the copyright owner. So you have to go to the publisher. And if you go behind the publisher's back, directly to the songwriter, they will get very upset. Likewise with the recording, if an artist is signed to an exclusive recording agreement, the record label owns that recording, not the artist. And even though you may know the artist or you may know the artist manager, if you go behind the record label's back directly to the artist or the manager, the record label will get very upset and possibly penalise you on fees or deny the usage. In terms of those long chains I showed you, from the UK to the US, to the manager to the artist, that's simply a factor of the way the contracts are set out. If you are in one market, so let's say you're in France, and you want to license a recording by a British artist, and it's owned by a record label that has a French office, you have to approach the French office. You can't go directly to the British office. If you did that, you would put the French office in breach of their agreement with their British counterpart. So it's simply the way the industry is structured. There are certain rules that you have to follow. But Steve, as you rightly said, the only way you get around that is if you deal with unsigned artists or unpublished songwriters, then you can go direct.
Okay, great stuff. Richard, thank you very much indeed for sharing so much. That's I think that's really helpful stuff, and hopefully everyone's got a lot from that. So we've reached the end of our hour. So thank you for everyone who's participated in this. It's great to have seen so many people on this webinar. I should just point out that the slides will be made available to everyone following this webinar. We'll send them out in an email very, very shortly, and you'll be able to click through to those YouTube links that Rich is going to include in that deck. So thank you very much for participating. It's great to have you all here. We hope to see you very soon at a future WFA meeting. Have a great day, and thanks very much for being part of